Hello and welcome to American Friction, the US politics podcast that you all know and love. I'm Jacob Jarvis, who you all know and I hope you know, at least feel some affection towards. And we're spoiling you with another one of our very best podcast friends today, someone else that you know and love. I'm joined by Vanity Fair special correspondent and Fast Politics host, the one, the only Molly Jong-Fast. Molly, welcome back to American Friction.
Thank you for having me.
I always ask you this first, and you always take the mick out of me for being very British. How are you? How's it going?
Oh, things are great over here. We are too dumb for democracy. No, today our senators did, in fact, it's like the thing is things are so dysfunctional here that when the Senate actually functions the way it's supposed to, it's kind of noteworthy.
Yeah.
So today we had all these senators talk to RFK. So basically, Donald Trump has done a lot of really bad anti-democratic things. And a lot of them have been co-signed by the Republican Party. They may have even, maybe they were they weren't 100% on board, but now that he's doing them, they figure, why not? At least reap the benefits. But this incredible letting RFK Jr. and I'm gonna quote Donald Trump here, go wild on health, may have perhaps been just a bridge too far, even for us. And so now there are actually a bunch of these United States senators who are Republicans and who are doctors and who are extremely worried about unvaccinated children, as well they should be.
Do you think there's maybe a contingent of Republican politicians at the moment that would kind of like to just freeze politics where it is for a little bit and just get to the midterms and hope for the best? Is the worry for them at the moment that everything Trump does and then anything RFK Jr. does could just be digging a hole as opposed to him getting more popular? Is there just a sort of desperation to just cling on at the moment?
Yeah, look, here's the problem. There are a number of things. Everything this administration is doing, almost everything is not popular. So, the deporting people, Americans, the polling on immigration is that Americans really want to just deport people. But it turns out when they see what that looks like, they don't love it so much. So They want to deport these mythological criminals who are in this country but who have done crimes. What they thought they wanted, but now as seeing it they don't, is they don't want the grandma who's lived here for 20 years. They don't want the 9-year-old whose mother died. They don't want, right now we have 200 children who the administration wants to send to Venezuela by themselves, right? You can't, we had a story yesterday of a girl who's the age of my youngest children who went to her immigration meeting and they just sent her back to a country, Honduras, where she hadn't lived in a decade, where she didn't speak the language.
Yeah.
And so I think that the implementation of a lot of these programs is so incredibly cruel that it's doing bad numbers for them. And then there's also the ruining the economy. The tension here, though, with the tariffs, which have made us an international pariah, there were a few things hit me, like yesterday watching Kim Jong, Xi, and Putin all hanging out.
Yeah.
And, meanwhile, we're going to war with Canada. So I do think there are a few things that are worse than the underlying economic voodoo that Trump is doing with the tariffs. But I would say the other part of the story, which I think a lot of us don't quite understand the reach of, is that Donald Trump, I don't think, is planning to lose power.
No.
So he's trying to do different things in order to keep power. And that is mid-decade redistricting in the House. Texas is giving him 5 congressional seats by redistricting. So I think there's a real tension of they're doing unpopular stuff, but they may be able to cheat and keep power.
You mentioned there the sort of when it comes to deporting people, for example, that, no one actually wants bad stuff to happen to people they know realistically. They just want it to happen to these people that don't exist. Are we finally seeing a bit of a reckoning in America of the natural conclusion to an era of ambiguity in politics? It reminds me a little bit of Brexit over here, for example, was sort of a choose your own adventure bit of politics, really. No one knew what it meant, and everyone thought it would be exactly what they wanted. They thought it could be both things at the same time. There was no consensus, but every single individual person would get exactly what they want. And is that why Trump is sort of going around like a pinball machine trying to keep people happy? Because it's this sort of individualism on steroids that has kicked in, that it's no one knew what they were getting, but the people voted for Trump kind of went, well, but I'll get exactly what I like. And thinking that politics works like that, which it never does. You always are going to have to compromise in politics.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's certainly, part of it was Trump offered people things that traditionally normal politicians don't offer because they are so impossible to produce. So, for example, one of the reasons why voters were mad at the Biden administration was inflation. Voters hate inflation. They hate it when things are more expensive. They hate it, they hate it, they hate it. So Donald Trump said, I'm going to make things cheaper, which who doesn't want that? Now, the reason politicians don't say stuff like that is because it's very hard to make things cheaper, especially if you're not going to intervene in our delightful non-interventionist interventionalist capitalism. You can't do that, right? You can't say you can't sell orange juice for more than a certain price. Ergo, he promised a lot of stuff he couldn't deliver. He also created a coalition that had different varying interests. So the thing that Trump did this time, which he was really successful with, was he got young voters, he got Latino voters. More. He grew he didn't get all of them. But he grew his share with both groups. And so now he is deporting those people's neighbors, some of those people. We see stories of the wife voted for Trump, the husband got deported. Everybody thought it would be Trumpism 2.0 would be something that it never was. And so, you see the most Trump regret from the young voters who are, the ones who saw him in the culture, the ones who saw him doing sneakers. One of the things Trump did, which at the time I thought was stupid, but turns out to have been completely brilliant, was he got into sneakers and crypto, and he got on podcasts, and he said to, Theo Vaughn, I'm going to make, stuff cheaper. And so a lot of young voters were like, this guy's on my podcast, and I don't even know who the Democrat is running. So they voted for him, and now that crew has pretty much soured on him for any number of reasons. At
least I'm sure Theo Von, he really pushed back against him. He's a tough going interviewer. He's sort of he's like America's Jeremy Paxman, that guy.
Yeah.
To avoid the T word for a little bit, if we can, let's talk about the Democrats a little bit. So Gavin Newsom, JB Pritzker, AOC, Zohran Mamdani, they all want to be the face of the Democratic resistance, it seems to me. Who is impressing you the most when it comes to that pushback?
So here's what I would say. I think that Democrats have had a really hard time getting their footing. And I think part of it has been that the first Democratic pushback to Trump was very successful. There was so much resistance. There was so much of a feeling, this guy is not who we are. When we elected him the second time, there was a feeling that maybe this is who we are.
Yeah.
And so, Trump wasn't a blip. He was he's going to be a decade of this country. So the question is, how do you push back to something that is, not a deviation from the norm, but the norm? And I think that's where we've seen some trouble. I want to talk about Newsom, not because I think ideologically ideologically, all of these people are very different, and I don't want to address their ideological stuff because I don't think it's relevant, but just like for the relevance of pushing back against Trumpism, what we've seen with Newsom is a little bit is that he sort of started out one way. He did he did a couple podcasts with. He had this very dumb idea to start podcasting.
It's always a bad idea. No one should start podcasting. Don't do it.
If you can do anything else, don't do this. Right? Get a real job.
Yeah, it's sort of economically not the best decision, I'm going to say.
But it's also just like, he's got to be the governor of California. That's like a real job. You don't have time to like do 5 other jobs. But he did that. It was a disaster and people didn't like it. And he was platforming all of these people who really do not need to be platformed by the governor of California. But then he sort of switched tact and he developed this very witty and very cutting and a little bit cringe social media presence. And he started just hitting back on everything, hitting back on everything. And actually, people really liked it. So ideologically, you can say what you want. He's really imperfect, and California has all sorts of issues. It is the 4th largest economy in the world. So, but I do think watching that sort of being able to change course, to see that you're doing something dumb and figure out something else that's more effective to break through is really good. And that's what we've seen. Pritzker has been quite good at that. People like AOC, Mondami is a really talented politician, speaks really well. People meet him. They like him. And then, there are a ton of people. It's just more of a question of, will you break through? The thing that I have really been struck by that I think is really problematic is in the United States Congress, we have some really good Congress people and some really good senators who are connecting. And then leadership is just having a terrible time breaking through. And I don't quite understand why, but people like Hakeem and Schumer just can't get through the noise. And people like Robert Garcia, who's the ranking member of Oversight, who's doing this hearing on Epstein, on the Epstein files, is doing a much better job. So you're seeing that some politicians, and I think with the leadership problem, they're just so surrounded by consultants, they're having the same problem that Harris had, which is they're just being focus grouped to death.
With that, is there just a bit of that the Democrats kind of seem to constantly believe that past success will be a recipe for future success? Because when you mentioned the resistance to Trump, for example, when Trump first came in, we were talking about how should they push back? And I looked back at the pushback in Trump 1, and like you say, I was like, actually, I don't think they did anything particularly wrong. The pushback was quite good. And then obviously
and it worked.
We saw how Biden won against Trump, and clearly they sort of thought, well, we can replay that, right? We can do that. Is that their biggest problem, that they need to realize that it's like the politics of America now is so far from fixed that what worked even 6 months ago or whatever will not work now. You just can't rely on that. And that is, as you say, this consultant class who obviously, I guess their job is to roll out and say, hey, we helped people win in the past, so we can do it again, right?
The consultant class, it is, I don't know what they're doing. I don't know why people are giving them money, but stop, okay? These people, just stop giving consultants money. You can break through, look at what works for other politicians and do that. Don't do the consultant. I mean, no greater group has fucked up Democrats more than the consultant class. I think, look, the problem is going to be whether or not we have free and fair elections. The problem is going to be redistricting, stealing power. That's going to be the problem. I don't think any of this is so popular. We see polls that show it's not so popular. Biden did. So if you want to go back to why Trump won again, I think there are two, if you wanted to sort of say there are two reasons. I think the original sin of Bidenism was that for 2 years, he really did almost no media. He just was so sort of siloed and closed off. I'm not going to speculate as to why. Then for the next 2 years, they just tried to get any attention they could, but they still didn't offer him. When you watch Donald Trump, and again, I'm not saying you should model your behavior on him, but all he does day after day, with the exception of this weekend when he completely disappeared, was, one day he brought the press corps 4 times to the Oval Office. He just kept bringing them back. And he just is constantly, all he cares about is dictating the news cycle and breaking through.
You mentioned Theo Von, who I was mean about his podcasting technique. I, for my sins, can find him quite funny occasionally. I like it when he interviews people like the Rizzler. But I remember when JD Vance went on his podcast, and I can't stand JD Vance, and I think he is a deeply odd person. But he came across as not odd on that podcast, to be fair. I watched it and I went, well, he looks kind of comfortable in his own skin. Is that some of the issue that maybe Democrats as well are struggling to always get through, because they're kind of always trying to do a thing, whereas in a way the right look like they're not trying to do a thing. They kind of are being themselves. Unfortunately, being themselves is kind of evil, but at least they are being authentic to an extent.
I just think that you cannot in this political climate, you cannot win unless you do everything. And because everything is so siloed, where I live on cable news and in my little magazine and on my podcast, you could be, just slightly more right-wing than I am and have no idea who I am, or be slightly more left-wing than I am and have. So, for example, if you're what I mean is, who cares about who I am? But if you're a politician and you're running for president and you go on all of these center-left podcasts, the center-right people are going to have no idea who the fuck you are.
Yeah.
And that's what we see. It's everything's so siloed. You have to go on everything and be everywhere. And I think there was a brief period, and this is if you're going to talk about how much there is in our politics in America, a sort of backlash to backlash to backlash phenomenon, right? Where you have things go. So if you're going to say there's a backlash to woke, which again, I would argue, I don't know. I think woke is good. I think it's good to not be shitty to people because they're trans or gay. I don't think that if a Democratic Party can't win without being nice to trans people, then we probably don't deserve to win, because I don't see any world where we have to throw people under the bus. But there was a consultant class that said, don't go on these shows of people you don't agree with, or they don't. And I think, and the thinking was that if you go on those shows, you elevate those people. But the reality is, if you go on those shows, they elevate you.
With that, the media landscape and how it's going, I don't want to ask you to do too much sort of journalist on journalist violence here.
Oh, I love it.
Okay, nice. Well, let's do it then, because I don't know anyone in America, so I can be as mean as I like. Left-leaning media, I just keep seeing New York Times pitchbot style headlines all the time, where it's just they're trying so hard to not say fascist. They're trying so hard to not say dictator. It's they are self-censoring to such an extent. Is there becoming any shift? Because to me, it's just increasingly becoming reality. Reality has pivoted into a time where it's sort of, you can't be doing your job properly unless you're calling some of this stuff out. Are we seeing any movement? Are there independent places? I know. Is Midas Touch going to save us all? I don't know. Is anything shifting?
So I'm not as down on mainstream media as a lot of people, and maybe that's because I write for a mainstream media publication, but part of me feels like the reporting is critical. And and there are only a few places who can actually do that reporting. ProPublica, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist. There aren't that many places that do real, The Economist doesn't do real reporting, but or not really the same way. But so you have not that many places that do that kind of reporting that have the legal infrastructure needed. The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Wired, that does the stuff that's needed for all of us to write on.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of that stuff. Look, as someone who writes commentary, writing commentary is really tricky. And it's not that you want, I don't think, like, MAGA is not reading the New York Times. They're not. If they were, they probably wouldn't be MAGA. Yeah. So I don't think that that's the issue. I think it's very hard to write. You want to explain what's happening without seeming hyperbolic, because when you seem hyperbolic, you kind of undermine your point. And so I don't necessarily give it. And I, as someone who sometimes has to write my own headlines, though often not, I'm more sympathetic to that problem. But I certainly think there's also a fair amount of self-censorship going on. And a great example of that is CBS, where they just canceled Colbert. They've taken some editorial control over 60 Minutes. They've done all sorts of things to try to avoid Donald Trump's ire. And that, I think, is really the kind of stuff where that's sort of happening behind the scenes, but you can sort of smell it. And that is the stuff that really, I mean, like, you have to think about this period in American life. Are there things that are happening here that will affect us in a decade, in 2 decades? Like, what will we be able to come back from some of these things? And like things like what RFK Jr. is doing right now with the mRNA research, like, that stuff where like a decade from now, if one of us gets cancer, we'll have a shorter life expectancy. I mean, that's stuff that will really have like just endless second order effects.
On the sort of self-censoring side of things, and this kind of, I don't know, this is more of an existential talking point, I guess, to get onto, and the sort of morality when it comes to America. So on journalist violence. So I saw Malcolm Gladwell, who is someone I very much admire generally. I enjoy his books. I know loads of people give them stick. I find them quite fun. I like them, and I think they're interesting. But he talked about how he was cowed into taking a stance on trans women in sports that was sort of the consensus. And then he's now backtracked on it and said he was ashamed for suggesting that trans women should play in female sports. And
can I say one thing about that moment? Because when I saw that, I was really struck by it too. And Tim Miller from The Bulwark, I think, had a really good point about that, which is you were going along with what was fashionable at the time. Yeah. And now you have changed your opinion for what is fashionable now. Yeah. Personally, I don't see a world where punishing trans people needs to be part of my way of interacting with the world. Like, life is hard enough. And by the way, like, real conservatives, true conservatives would not give a fuck what other people do with their bodies. So the fact that he like brought that back up was I thought of it as such a way to tell on himself. And I was really surprised and so disappointed by that.
I found it bizarre for someone who is meant to be so intellectually curious. Like, that's his whole thing. He has a podcast called Revisionist History, and he did some revisionist history on himself, which he could have if he said, my opinion has changed. I might have respected it. I don't have to agree with every opinion of every author I read. Like, I could still read Gladwell. But the thing I'm trying to get to with it is like, is that how I think America has always thought of itself as having sort of the American dream, American ideals, American morality? We've seen other flip-flops, sort of Zuckerberg, Bezos, also going along with the trends and what's fashionable. Has Trump broken the sort of moral compass of America, does it feel like? Does it feel like there just isn't that sense of any consensus whatsoever anymore?
No, it was already broken. If you need Donald Trump to break your morality, then you never had much to begin with. I think that the big problem, if anything, was that Americans decided their billionaires were good people who were going to protect them and run the media organizations in a way that was for the public good. And I think we've all learned a really good lesson that really, really wealthy people don't give a fuck about you or me. And, look, what is, I think, going to be a problem for them is that this crop of really wealthy people seem genuinely disinterested in doing anything to help people. And someone like Elon is a great example of someone who made tons and tons of money from government subsidies and then proceeded, instead of, like the Carnegies building hospitals and museums, he decided to take money away from poor people. Make sure your grandmother's Social Security check was $64 instead of $67. And so I think that level of disgusting immorality, they are not ashamed of. I think they should be.
Yeah, I just find it startling how many sort of grown men seem to be saying in America now, oh, like, I got bullied. It's like, no, you didn't. You didn't get bullied. You just, you had an opinion because it was fashionable because you don't like to think too much. Like, fair enough.
And, or you had a shitty opinion, which is fine. Have your shitty opinion. There's a whole section of the internet that's delighted with your shitty opinion. You can be friends with J.K. Rowling, but ultimately, it's still, this cruel opinion towards people for who they are, and I think there's a certain kind of, I think a lot about, the guy who stole the hat from the little boy.
Yeah. The CEO guy, right?
And then he came out and he said, life moves at you fast, right? Like, I don't know, but I would know to be ashamed of something like that. Yeah. If I stole a kid's hat, I wouldn't be like, yeah, that kid needed to learn what it's like to be surrounded by assholes. Like, he's going to learn soon enough. So that's my feeling, is there's a certain section of the population that really that just wants to rape and pillage the earth and be shitty to other members of society, and they happen to be the richest of us.
Yeah, it's totally like the age of the man baby taking over. Mm-hmm. I've got two final questions for you, Molly, and one is sticking on the slightly negative vibes. One is slightly nicer, don't worry, to end on.
I'll take it.
So obviously I was going to ask you more about RFK Jr., but we've kind of touched on that already. Beyond the sort of obvious of Trump and JD Vance, who are the awful people that I should really be focusing on at the minute? Who do you think are behaving in the ways that are clearly terrible, but that aren't maybe being called out as much as they should be?
I mean, Mike Johnson is right now trying to prevent the Epstein victims from getting any kind of closure or transparency. Yeah. So there's this Epstein Act, Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, all the Democrats.
Yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene has weirdly put herself in a good light this week. It's been quite bizarre.
I mean, I watched her at that press conference and I was like, between that and Rand Paul being like, you can't just blow up ships. You got to have due process. I was like, oh man. Yeah. So, I think those two, that Mike Johnson really is standing in the way of releasing these files. He's doing it because Trump has told him to, and he serves at the pleasure of Donald Trump. But Mike Johnson has told us that he is this arbiter of morality, who is, in a very religious church and who does all of these very religious things. I don't think covering for pedophilia is a religious thing. And religious people have done it. But it doesn't, I don't think it makes you a good Christian. So that would be something I would suggest.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that one. Finally, is there anything nice happening in US politics that's going under the radar? Like, are there people just doing some consistently good stuff anywhere that you're sort of looking out and thinking, okay, that's given me a bit of hope?
So this is like bad, but also good. People are doing these ICE warning stuff where they're they're watching for. So in Chicago, we have it in New York, but not quite as badly as we probably will. But we have ICE, this fake law, Donald Trump's militia in different states, in different blue states and blue cities, just picking people up and putting them in detention. And that's it. No due process. So a lot of times they're citizens. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're deported to their home countries. Sometimes they're just left in a holding facility. Sometimes they're deported to other countries where they can never come back from, like Guatemala or the Sudan. But there are Americans who have started these ad hoc groups to warn if ICE is on their street, if ICE is around, and that kind of stuff. Look, do you want to live in a country where that's the kind of thing that makes you feel good? No.
No.
But there are people who are doing brave things, and bravery, I think, is a little bit contagious. So I think about those people, and that makes me feel a little better.
Yeah, I'd say, the sort of the sense that there is still some community going on is always nice to hold on to.
And I just want to say, since this is like, you're British and the Canadians are also super pissed at us. Most of us do not like what is happening in our country. Yeah. Most of us did not sign on for this. And one of my kids was saying, was talking about what Donald Trump is doing in the army. He's doing just terrible things to our army. And I was able to say to him, we did everything we could to prevent this. And we are trying to get our country back to normal.
Yeah. Well, I hope sooner than later. But you're always welcome over here, but it's kind of not that normal over here either. But Molly, thank you so much for your time on American Friction.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to all of you for listening to American Friction. As always, remember, if you want to help us keep having conversations such as this one with Molly, you can back us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/American Friction to sign up. There's a link in the show notes. A quick reminder, if you can't do that, if you can't back us financially, we totally get that, but please do rate, review us wherever you're listening to the show and make sure you are subscribed. You've been listening to American Friction. I'm Jacob Jarvis. Make sure you keep listening to American Friction.